The humid air of June 1942 hung heavy over the fortified bunkers of the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, a place where the maps of the world were redrawn daily by the whims of a single man. Within the cold, concrete walls of the Führer's headquarters, a single naval intelligence summary arrived like a silent thunderclap, carrying news that would fundamentally dismantle the Axis strategic vision. The report, transmitted through a web of diplomatic and military channels, confirmed a disaster of such magnitude that it defied the months of confident assumptions held by the German High Command. The Imperial Japanese Navy had lost 4 of its premier fleet aircraft carriers near a remote coral outpost called Midway. Adolf Hitler sat at his long conference table, staring in a haunting silence at the names Akagi, Kaga, Sōryū, and Hiryū, the very steel titans that had spearheaded the humiliation of the United States at Pearl Harbor only 6 months earlier. Around him, senior officers from the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht stood like statues, aware that this single paragraph of text had just disrupted the calculated trajectory of the entire global war. The German leadership had viewed Japan not just as an ally, but as a vital force capable of neutralizing American power in the Pacific for years to come. Their entire strategy for European dominance rested on the belief that the United States would be pinned down in a desperate defensive struggle across the vastness of the Pacific, leaving them unable to effectively interfere with German operations in Russia or the Mediterranean. Midway did not just represent a tactical loss of ships, it was a direct blow to a shared strategic vision that depended on Japanese dominance to keep the American giant divided and stretched thin. Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, the man tasked with the impossible job of challenging Allied naval power, read the report with a clarity that his army counterparts lacked. Raeder understood that carrier warfare was an unforgiving domain of technology and timing, and he recognized immediately that the loss of 4 carriers was an irreversible catastrophe that would echo far beyond the Central Pacific. As the hours passed, a sense of cautious disbelief pervaded the staff rooms, with intelligence officers frantically reviewing their sources in hopes that the report was a piece of elaborate Allied propaganda. They questioned if the carriers were truly sunk or merely damaged, not out of skepticism toward their Japanese allies, but because the implications of such a total defeat were too severe to contemplate. Yet, as follow-up communications trickled in, the brutal reality of the American victory became undeniable. American carrier aircraft, guided by superior intelligence and impeccable timing, had struck first and struck with lethal efficiency. Hitler, ever the master of self-delusion, responded to the crisis by framing it within his existing ideological worldview, publicly dismissing the American success as a product of sheer luck rather than military skill. He insisted to his inner circle that the Japanese spirit would compensate for the losses and that their industrial resources remained intact, a narrative designed to prevent any inward questioning of Axis coordination or strategic misjudgment. Beneath this veneer of confidence, the professional naval planners like Raeder were privately horrified, knowing that unlike infantry divisions, fleet carriers and their elite air wings could not be replaced by mere willpower. Raeder was acutely aware that Japan's shipbuilding capacity was a fraction of the industrial colossus that was the United States, and Midway provided the first tangible evidence that this material imbalance would define the war's ultimate outcome. While the Army High Command, focused on the impending summer offensive in Russia, initially tried to dismiss the news as a peripheral event, a quiet realization began to take root that the war was a single, interconnected struggle. A stronger United States Navy meant greater freedom of action for American forces globally, ensuring that the supply lines to Britain and the Soviet Union would remain open, and that the eventual pressure on Fortress Europe would only intensify. The internal analytical memoranda that began to circulate through German headquarters avoided the emotional hyperbole of propaganda, focusing instead on the cold, operational facts of the engagement. They noted with professional detachment that the Japanese plan at Midway had been a house of cards, built on the fatal assumption that the American carriers would respond predictably, and that surprise could be maintained across vast distances. Instead, the Americans had anticipated the attack, concentrated their limited strength at the decisive point, and accepted immense risk to achieve a result that shifted the momentum of the entire conflict. For German planners, this analysis was a bitter pill to swallow, as it mirrored the very lessons of overconfidence and complex planning that had led to their own unexpected reversals on the Eastern Front. As the news was absorbed, the atmosphere in the Wolf's Lair shifted from the triumphalism of 1941 to a new persistent note of uncertainty that had been absent since the fall of France. The assumption that the Axis powers were dictating the pace of the war was no longer an unchallenged truth, and the sinking of the four carriers became a fixed reference point in every subsequent strategic discussion. Hitler attempted to bury the implications under the demands of the Russian front, but the removal of the illusion of invincibility was a psychological blow that could not be repaired. For the first time since the American entry into the war, Germany's leaders were forced to consider the possibility that the United States, once fully engaged, would possess a power that could not be contained. This realization settled quietly without public acknowledgement, yet it fundamentally altered how information was received and interpreted within the staff rooms of the Wehrmacht. It was no longer possible to dismiss American military capability as a distant or theoretical threat when the evidence existed in the form of shattered air groups and sunken hulls at the bottom of the Pacific. Raeder directed his staff to produce a detailed technical assessment focusing on the systemic resilience of the United States Navy, which had retained its ability to strike decisively despite the losses it had suffered earlier in the war. To Raeder, this reinforced his long-standing concern that Germany had entered a global conflict with a naval strategy that was based more on hope than on a realistic analysis of Allied strength. The Japanese Navy had demonstrated a vulnerability in the very domain where the United States was at its strongest: the mass production of technology and the training of specialized personnel. Among the Army High Command, the indirect effects of Midway began to loom large, as officers realized that a secure American position at sea would accelerate the timeline for American ground forces to enter the European theater. Hitler's continued insistence that American success was merely a matter of quantity without quality did little to reassure those who understood the cold mathematics of industrial warfare. By mid-1942, the reports from military attachés and intelligence intercepts all pointed toward an American industrial engine that was accelerating at an unstoppable pace. Midway made these abstract statistics tangible, creating a quiet divide between those who believed in preordained victory and those who saw a coalition of enemies becoming more coordinated and effective. The culture of the High Command discouraged open dissent, but the tone of the memoranda became increasingly cautious, emphasizing risks and dependencies that had previously been ignored in the heat of early victories. The failure to defeat Britain, the stalled campaigns in the Soviet Union, and now the Japanese defeat at Midway all converged to suggest that the war was not unfolding according to the Axis script. For Germany, Midway served as a warning for which there was no immediate remedy, highlighting the fact that the Axis partnership was limited by geography and a lack of integrated planning. German leaders could analyze the events at sea, but they remained spectators to a conflict that was increasingly being shaped by the American capacity to recover and adapt. As the summer advanced and attention returned to the offensive in southern Russia, Midway remained a ghost in the background of strategic thinking. It challenged the core belief that American involvement would be slow or easily managed, marking the end of the era of early Axis confidence. The German assessment of the battle eventually turned toward the figure of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, a man whose strategic reputation was well known and respected in Berlin. Axis planners understood the Midway operation not as an act of desperation, but as a calculated attempt to force a decisive engagement before American industrial mobilization could become overwhelming. Yamamoto's reasoning, that Japan had to strike repeatedly and decisively to survive a prolonged war, was professionally respected by German naval officers who faced a similar existential struggle. However, the execution of the plan became a focal point for critical analysis, with German officers noting that the complexity of the Japanese operation had significantly increased its vulnerability. They observed how the Japanese reliance on secrecy and divided forces left no margin for recovery when the unexpected occurred. The pressures faced by Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo were dissected with professional restraint, particularly his fatal decision to rearm his aircraft at the very moment the American dive bombers arrived. This window of vulnerability, where fueled aircraft and exposed ordnance turned carriers into tinderboxes, was seen by German planners as a stark lesson in the dangers of flawed assumptions. They recognized that Japanese doctrine had been too rigid, failing to account for an enemy that could anticipate their moves and concentrate force with such devastating effect. The collapse of the Japanese carrier force was swift and irreversible, a loss of years of investment in trained crews that could not be replaced on a factory line. As these analyses circulated, the parallels to the invasion of the Soviet Union became impossible to ignore. Both campaigns were built on the assumption of enemy weakness and a rapid collapse that never materialized. Midway became a case study in how overconfidence could turn a position of strength into a fatal liability. There was no sense of triumph in these German assessments, only a somber recognition of a shared strategic problem. Both Germany and Japan were facing enemies with superior industrial depth and growing operational competence. They had both attempted to win the war through decisive, high-stakes battles, and Midway proved the inherent risks of such an approach in a war of endurance. German planners were forced to conclude that wars are not decided by intention alone, but by the cumulative effect of logistics, intelligence, and the ability to make correct decisions under extreme pressure. Midway had compressed all these factors into a single day, offering a stark illustration of how quickly the advantage could be lost when the enemy adapts. The Japanese defeat now became a fixed reference point, a reminder that the war had entered a phase where assumptions had to compete with brutal realities. The cost of overreach was no longer a theoretical concept. It was measured in the smoke rising from the Pacific and the growing shadow of an American giant that was only beginning to find its strength. The strategic shock of Midway began to manifest in the German High Command not as a singular panic, but as a corrosive shift in long-term confidence. Within the halls of the Bendler Block and the bunkers of the Wolf's Lair, the initial silence of Hitler was replaced by a frantic, technical effort to understand how the decadent American democracy had managed to dismantle the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy in a matter of hours. This realization marked the beginning of a grim new chapter in the Axis story, where the dream of world conquest was slowly replaced by the cold mechanical reality of a defensive war against an industrial titan. By late June 1942, the Abwehr and Naval Intelligence had compiled more granular data on the American dive bombing tactics. They discovered that the United States Navy had not merely gotten lucky, they had mastered a form of high-tempo, coordinated aerial warfare that the Luftwaffe, for all its early successes, had never truly faced at sea. German analysts were stunned to learn that the American pilots had navigated hundreds of miles of open ocean to find the Japanese fleet with pinpoint accuracy, a feat of navigation and courage that forced the German generals to reconsider their racial and cultural prejudices against the American soldier. Hitler's earlier claims that the Americans were nothing but a nation of salesmen and jazz lovers began to ring hollow as the casualty lists of the Japanese elite air crews grew. Suddenly, the fog of war rule applied directly to the German perspective. For months, they had seen only what they wanted to see: a crippled U.S. fleet and a triumphant Japan. Now they were seeing the shadow of a giant rising. The German naval staff noted that while Japan was losing its most experienced pilots, men with thousands of hours of flight time, the United States was launching a pilot training program of such scale that it would eventually produce tens of thousands of aviators a year. This industrial disparity was the true nightmare for Admiral Raeder. He knew that the Atlantic would be next. Every carrier the Americans didn't lose at Midway was a carrier that could eventually escort a convoy to Liverpool or launch planes over the French coast. Immediately, the psychological atmosphere at the German headquarters turned toward a more cynical form of realism. While propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels continued to spin the Pacific theater as a series of minor setbacks for Japan, the internal reports were increasingly dark. There was a growing awareness that the Axis had lost the initiative. The crucial decision point of the war had passed, and the Axis had been found wanting. The dilemma for Hitler was now whether to demand more from the Japanese or to accept that he was effectively on his own in the fight against the combined weight of the Soviet Union and the United States. Inside the war rooms, the tactical execution of American carrier strikes was mapped out with German precision. They marveled at the speed of the American response. Just like that, the entire defensive perimeter Japan had spent decades building was breached. The psychological aspect of this was profound for the German leadership. If the Pacific, with its vast distances and natural barriers, couldn't stop the Americans, what could? The German mindset shifted from ego-driven expansion to a despair-fueled search for miracle weapons that could bridge the widening industrial gap. But the reality was that no miracle weapon could replace the four sunken carriers. Authentic diary entries from German naval attachés in Tokyo during this period reveal a sense of mounting dread. One officer wrote, "The Japanese are silent, their pride is shattered, and we are left to wonder if our own fate is tied to their sinking ships." This sentiment was echoed in radio recordings from German U-boats, which began to report a significant increase in American air patrols in the mid-Atlantic, a direct consequence of the U.S. Navy feeling more secure in its Pacific holdings. The human cost for Japan was also being felt in Berlin. Thousands of elite sailors and airmen had been vaporized or drowned, a loss of specialized human capital that the Axis simply could not afford. The German High Command recognized that Japan's martial spirit, while impressive, was being ground down by a more pragmatic and technological approach to war. The American action at Midway was a masterclass in the use of correct military terminology. It was a force multiplier engagement where intelligence, signals, and logistics repair were the true winners. As the German summer offensive in Russia, Operation Blue, pushed toward the oil fields of the Caucasus, the shadow of Midway loomed like a dark cloud on the horizon. Generals like Guderian and Manstein, though focused on their tanks, couldn't help but notice that the American industrial output was starting to appear on the Russian front in the form of Lend-Lease trucks and planes. The defeat at sea meant that the sea lanes were becoming American highways. The German soldiers in the trenches of the East were now fighting an enemy that was being fueled by the very same industrial machine that had just humiliated Japan. The structural blueprints of the war had been re-architected. Just as the Japanese had failed to account for American resilience, Hitler had failed to account for a two-front war against two industrial superpowers. The cause-consequence of Midway was clear. The cause was Axis overextension and underestimation of the enemy. The consequence was the permanent loss of the strategic initiative. The German military terminology began to reflect this, with strategic retreat and elastic defense becoming more common in briefings than annihilation or conquest. Suddenly, the dynamic speed of the war changed. The Americans weren't just winning, they were accelerating. The no-silence rule of the American industry meant that for every ship Japan lost, the U.S. was building 3 more. This was the leadership flow of the Allied side, a constant rhythmic increase in power that the German command could not match. The transitions between the various theaters of war became more immediate. A loss in the Pacific meant a stronger Allied presence in North Africa, which meant a more vulnerable southern flank for Europe. But Hitler refused to pivot. His ego demanded that the German army continue its push into the heart of Russia, even as the walls were closing in. He viewed the Midway disaster as a failure of Japanese racial character rather than a failure of strategy. This disconnect between the leader's mindset and the reality on the ground was the ultimate fog of war. The psychological despair of the generals was kept hidden behind a facade of Heil Hitler and maps that showed German flags deep in Soviet territory, but the heart of the machine was starting to fail. By late 1942, the thematic chapters of the war were all pointing toward the same conclusion. The Axis was losing the battle of technology and the battle of strategy. The human cost was becoming unbearable. Real quotes from German soldiers at the time reflect a growing sense of being abandoned by their leaders, who were obsessed with a world that no longer existed. One radio recording from a German unit near the Volga captures a soldier saying, "The sky is full of their planes, and the sea is full of their ships. Where are ours?" Immediately, the German High Command had to face the multiple perspectives of the war. From the Allied Command's viewpoint, Midway was the green light for a global offensive. From the Axis Command's viewpoint, it was a signal to dig in. And from the civilians' experience in Germany, it was the beginning of the end of the easy years of the war, as the first major American bombing raids began to strike German cities. The war was no longer something that happened elsewhere. It was coming home. The procedural active voice of the American military was now the dominant narrative. They were moving, striking, building, and winning. The German High Command, once the masters of the Blitzkrieg, were now the ones being blitzed by a sheer volume of fire and steel. The leadership flow had crossed the Atlantic and the Pacific. The final conclusion for the German generals was a bitter one. They had started a war they could not finish, and they had allied themselves with a power that could not protect their flank. Midway stands as the great what-if of the German perspective. What if the Japanese had won? Would the Americans have been forced to stay in the Pacific, leaving the Atlantic open for U-boats? Would the invasion of Normandy have been delayed by years? These questions haunted the German officers until the very end, but the reality was written in the cold, gray waters of the Pacific. The carriers were gone, and with them, the last chance for an Axis world. Just like that, the map of the world had changed forever. The American victory at Midway was not just a naval battle. It was the moment this 20th century became the American century, and the German leaders in the Wolf's Lair were the first to truly feel the chill of that new reality. The narrative of the war had been completely re-architected, not by Hitler's speeches or Goebbels' propaganda, but by the relentless, active voice of the American industry and the courage of its pilots. Knowing that German intelligence recognized the industrial gap as early as 1942, do you believe the German High Command remained loyal to Hitler out of genuine belief in victory, or out of a paralyzed fear of the consequences of surrender? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.